Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Megan Burns, and I'm the Director of Marketing at the Tourette Association of America. I'd like to welcome you to our session today, Oliver Sacks, His Own Life, a Filmmaker Talkback. As part of virtual conference, we would like to thank our sponsors, the Warner Fund and Pharma, as well as all donors and sponsors for making this free conference possible. To support educational programming like this, you may visit tourette.org/donate to make a contribution today. During the session, we'd love to include your voice in the conversation. Please use the comment panel below to submit your questions, and we'll address them during the Q&A at the end of the session. It is now my pleasure to introduce Amanda Talty, the President and CEO of the Tourette Association of America, for some opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Sunday. I am thrilled to welcome you all to a panel discussion around Dr. Oliver Sacks and the new PBS American Masters film, Oliver Sacks, His Own Life. This film did an exceptional job at showcasing Dr. Sacks's passion for learning, writing, and really, he became a voice for people who needed it. By doing so, he helped raise awareness for many conditions, including Tourette Syndrome. His gift was being able to humanize TS to a broad public when there was very little working knowledge back in the 70s and 80s. Dr. Sacks was deeply connected to the Tourette Association of America and the Tourette Syndrome community, for which we will be forever grateful. Today we'll honor his legacy as we will be joined by an incredible panel, including the film's director, Ric Burns, Kate Edgar, the executive director of the Oliver Sacks Foundation, and Lowell Handler, who had the incredible opportunity to travel the world with Dr. Sacks to report on Tourette during the 1980s. And the conversation will be led by Ben Brown, host of Tourette's podcast. Before we pass it off, TAA conference attendees had the exclusive access to watch the film and join an extraordinary panel discussion for free. If you've not yet had an opportunity to do so, there is still time. We'll put the credentials in the chat. But for now, let us kick off this incredible discussion with the trailer for the film.
I first saw my analyst of 66. We are now in our 50th year, and we're beginning to get somewhere.
Please welcome Dr. Oliver Sacks.
He was the first major intellectual who spoke about diseases to the general public in a way that they could understand.
His writing brought back a central aspect of medicine, treat the person and not the disease.
Life threw so many things at him, some of which he brought on himself. He was the first to admit.
It was at that time they discovered that he was gay.
Where do you go where your mother calls you an abomination? You go to San Francisco and stop writing home.
From an early age, it was understood that I was going to be a doctor. My brother Michael was diagnosed as schizophrenic. I became terrified for him.
Michael was one of the reasons Oliver did what he did.
Much of my life has been spent trying to imagine what it's like to be another human being.
His great gift was storytelling about the human condition in a medical context, emphasizing the fact that they saw the world in different ways.
He would tell these stories so well that people who are brave, lonely, and left out are storied back into the world.
Oliver was absolutely dismissed by fellow neurologists.
He had his critics.
For someone to say that he exploited his patients, I think that's absolutely wrong.
Are you a doctor first and then a writer? The real answer is that I'm both, and in important ways they blend together.
Oliver never lost that sense of wonder.
10 days before he died, he was writing.
I daren't tell you what I'm thinking.
Okay, that was incredible. So we will pass it off to Ben to lead the conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. It's been a lot of fun taking part in this conference and connecting with new people. And I'm particularly excited to be on this panel. I watched the documentary, and all of you should. It was fantastic, just really open and raw, lots of archival imagery and great photographs, quotable lines, just everything I like to see in a documentary, in addition to having such a great central figure being Oliver Sacks. And I'd like to thank our panel for being here. Amanda gave your names a minute ago, but I'd like each panelist to just go around one by one and give a brief introduction. Let's start with Kate. If you could make sure you're unmuted and please introduce yourself and let the audience know your relation to Oliver or to the documentary. Kate, starting with you.
Hey, I'm really happy to be here. Kate Edgar. I'm the director of the Oliver Sacks Foundation, but more importantly, I spent basically the last 35 years of my life working side by side with Oliver, getting to work on all of his books, getting to know a lot of the people he wrote about, including my good friend Lowell Handler. And so I'm thrilled to be here. I'm so sorry that Oliver couldn't be here because he passed on, but he really had a special passion for Tourette. He wanted to really understand that condition. He found it one of the most fascinating he'd ever come across. And I think, as may have been mentioned, he became a part of the Tourette, then called the Tourette Syndrome Association, back in 1974, when it was literally just a handful of people sitting around a kitchen table. And here we are almost 50 years later.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kate. And we want to talk more about that as well. Lowell, let's go to you. If you could give a brief introduction.
Well, I was Oliver's friend and photographer. We first met in 1986, and that's the same day that I met Kate, and we've known each other since then. So she said it's 35 years. It's a long time. It was a long time ago. But Oliver and I were friends until his death. And I worked primarily doing photography for Oliver, but also I think along with Shane, I was the conduit for what Kate mentioned, which was his understanding of Tourette.
Lowell, thanks. We're going to talk more with you. Rick, could you introduce yourself real quick?
Sure, I'm thrilled to be here, Ben. You know, I'd met Kate Edgar. I'd never met Oliver when I got a call in early January 2015 saying that Oliver had mortal cancer and about 6 months to live, and would my colleagues and I come in and film him. He was 81, and we just stopped what we were doing and did that. And a couple of weeks later, found ourselves in Oliver's apartment on Horatio Street in Greenwich Village in New York. And it was the beginning of 90 hours of filming with him that February, in April, and in June. And he did indeed die on August 30th, 2015. So it was an incredible privilege to spend time at such a moment at crossroads in anybody's life. And I can, for sure, in Oliver Sacks's life.
Well, it was amazing what you were able to capture with him and how open he was, and you know, just very raw in how he described his past, and definitely made for an amazing story. Kate, could you just give us maybe a brief introduction about who Oliver Sacks was and his relation to the TS community? You started on that, but maybe go a little bit deeper on, you know, just for anybody who's uninitiated, who was Oliver and why did he care so much about the TS community?
Well, I think, you know, he was a neurologist first and foremost, and a storyteller. He was fascinated by all kinds of neurological conditions and what it might be like from the inside to have those conditions. He first became really aware of Tourette when he had written about a group of patients in his book called Awakenings who had, because of some drug interactions and other reasons, they began having Tourette-like syndrome. at the time, Tourette syndrome was considered to be an extremely rare condition. But Oliver was well versed in 19th century neurology, including the reports of Gilles de la Tourette, the man who named the syndrome. And he started thinking about it. And I think around 1971, a patient sort of showed up in his office who had Tourette syndrome. He later wrote about that person in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. He was referred to in the story as Witty Ticky Ray. Ray, by the way, I speak to him frequently. He's doing really well 50 years on. So Oliver was very interested in Tourette, and he began to realize after his first encounter that it was much more common than the medical profession thought. And so that launched really his interest in the syndrome, and he got to know the nascent Tourette Syndrome Association, and then embarked on many great adventures with Lowell and with Shane, who you also see in the movie. If you haven't read it, one of the things in a recent book of Oliver's is an account of how he and Lowell traveled the world, including going to a community in Canada where a very high percentage of the people have Tourette syndrome. So that's the background.
And so he was involved, as you were saying, in the Tourette Association, back then called the Tourette Syndrome Association, pretty steadily into the 70s and 80s. And I don't remember what conference it was exactly. It might have been Washington, D.C., but I was very young, so I didn't have a full grasp on who Oliver Sacks was. I knew he was a famous scientist, and I knew that because the photo I saw of him, and it might have been a photo that Lowell took, I don't know, but it looked exactly what I thought a famous scientist would look like. And so that was my frame of reference when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. But I remember all the celebration around him being at that conference, at that Tourette conference. And again, too young to follow what he was saying from the stage, but I remember I really liked his voice. He sounded like somebody I would want to know. And then meeting him briefly as he came through. And then a few years later, I got my mom's copy of An Anthropologist on Mars. And I think it was in that book maybe where there was the story about the surgeon with Tourette. And I still have your copy, Mom, if you're watching. Anyway, he just became chiseled into my list of people I like. And seeing the documentary and seeing Shane Festel, someone else who I got to know when I was a little kid. I mean, it took me back to a lot of things, and I guess got to reconnect me with who I wish I knew Oliver was when I was a kid. But it just really amazing. And Lowell, I mean, could you talk about what it was like to travel the world with Oliver? Maybe speak to how that impacted your life, and if there are any defining lessons that you took from him in your experiences with him.
There were quite a few. I mean, it had a huge impact on my life. I was just barely 30 or 31. And Oliver was in his mid 50s. So I was pretty young, and I don't think I had ever been to, I had definitely never been to the Netherlands. I had been to the UK, and we traveled a lot in the Netherlands and in the UK, and then all across this country in a car in this country, literally from California all the way back to New York. But it was one of the great experiences of my lifetime, I have to say. And he was really trying to see what it was like to have Tourette. And as I said before, Shane and I were the conduits for this. And during this period of time, he was sort of living the Tourette through me. And I learned a great deal about him, but I also learned a lot about human nature from him. And I also, I think, found out things about myself that I didn't know. it was an incredible experience. It went on for a couple of years. It was in the late 80s. And it was just an amazing time, you know. I took a lot. I was working as his photographer, but I was also his sidekick. You know, maybe he was my sidekick. I don't know. At times, maybe his muse. And we became friends. You get to know somebody pretty well if you're staying in the same hotel and rooms next to each other, and you see each other every single day and all night. You get to know somebody pretty well after a few months of that.
Well, you know, one thing that's interesting is being his photographer, and empathy takes such an active role in photography. If you're doing candid stuff and, you know, you want to make people look good and, you know, or you want to capture their humanity and all that, it is about getting to know people. And
Because you're a photographer, I heard.
Yes. Yeah. And, you know, that's a big part of it. And I love the documentary put so much emphasis on his empathy and, you know, him putting himself in the person that he's talking to try to kind of get where they're coming from. And I feel like photography, it gets into that a bit where.
Oh, absolutely. But, you know, the thing is, if it were another doctor somewhere else, he would have read a book. It wasn't enough for Oliver to read the book or a book or an article. He had to go thousands of miles with somebody. And at the time, I have to say, I had it pretty severely. Kate remembers, much more pronounced than it is now, because it's very mild now, but not 30 years ago. It was very severe Tourette symptoms. And he wanted to live the whole, you know, constant, as I said in the documentary, he was constantly talking about taking off his white coat and going into the world to see how whatever condition it was, whether it was Tourette or something else, existed in real life. And he went to extremes to do it.
I got to say, I'm, you know, speaking of taking off the white coat, which I think, Lowell, you know, you're so good in this film, but I'm so thrilled that Ric was able to capture footage of Oliver out there, footage of him with patients, which are just, you know, so great to have now that he's not with us. And certainly, Ric, you were under a huge amount of time pressure. In that case, you were not only trying to finish a movie, but to get the footage before Oliver died, as we all knew he would. So thank you for that.
Well, yeah, Ric, can we go to you on this? What attracted you to this project? Like, what was it about Oliver that inspired you to take this on?
You know, it was pretty a deeply intuitive sense of how the crucial data that Oliver Sacks was after, which is this stuff, the insides of us all. What's going on in here? And it's the only stuff that matters. What does it feel like to be Ben? You know, and we're all gifted with that. And all of us is not just human beings. You know, as Oliver said in a wonderful piece in the Times, announcing his mortality. I mean, we're all sentient beings, thinking animals. And what an extraordinary kind of accident and privilege it is to be there. And that's the thing, this thing inside us all, inside the darkness of our own being, the part that none of us can see of each other, that he was this lifelong student and doctor and kind of astronaut. He wanted to find out about it. And what a remarkable thing. And in that respect, he showed how close being a novelist is, being a scientist is, being a psychologist is, being a photographer is. All these professions, you know, science and art and storytelling turn out to be the same thing. How do you tell, how can you figure out what's going on in there? When you think about things like empathy, photography, neurology, it starts out by sounding like something that's very different. But, what Lowell Handler is noticing when he's taking a photograph, which after all is capturing the external details, begins, though it doesn't end, with what Oliver was doing when he was noticing what's going on with this person. And it starts with sometimes a form of mimicry. It's not mockery, it's mimicry. And you see that very much, like when someone, and Kate can testify to this, and Lowell so much better than I, Oliver was a helpless reduplicator. If somebody moved in a certain way, Oliver would move in a certain way, as if he knew it would conjure up to repeat how someone moved, or the facial expression they used, what it felt like to be on the inside. There's an incredible moment where he puts his face to the glass with an orangutan that we have in the film, piece of archival footage. And when that primate smudges up her face in a certain way, Oliver smudges up his face too. He's trying to feel what it's like to be her. And I felt you could feel how powerfully, what an incredible motive he had to be able to reduplicate inside himself what others feel inside themselves, and then find some usable form of exchange in words to traffic in who they were, which is why Robert Krulwich, the great journalist who knew Oliver so well, said he was storying people back into the world. Ben, what an incredible thing to do with you. And he was trying to story himself back into the world, because he knew that we were all, again, as he said in that same piece, where he talked about being a sentient being, we are all irreducibly different. We're all born absolutely genetically, neurologically unique, and we develop into even greater uniqueness. And so what do we share in common? Our uniqueness. And so our job as people is to bridge these infinite ranges of difference we have. Kind of incredible agency he gave to all of us about what it is to live alone inside our own selves. And for that, I feel, that kind of, I won't say, Ben, that's why we made the movie, but something that comes across powerfully in his writing. And as you point out, so in this tone of his voice, which seemed to suggest it's okay. That's so magnetic about all.
Yeah, the personality is very comforting, and obviously the word empathy is going to keep coming up here, and it should. He obviously is a very, well, he's had a very potent impact on how people feel about themselves. And like Kate was saying, when you're tasked with portraying the life and potency of somebody like Dr. Sachs, the pressure's on. How long did you spend on this? And were you, I was thrilled with the documentary. I thought it was fantastic, and the takeaways were amazing and powerful. Did you feel like you you accomplished what you set out to do with it?
My motto, I say this more frequently than I care to admit, is the deal with any project is you try to kill it before it kills you. So the proof, I'm sitting here tonight, so it must have been a success, because it feels like that kind of battle each time. So it's humblingly difficult to try not screw it up. But imagine in this case, what we had Kate Edgar, we had Oliver's incredible partner, Bill Hayes, and that's so much a huge part of the story.
Absolutely.
The story has this kind of movie-like narrative thing. He's his own worst enemy for so long in his life. He struggles with so much torment going on from an early age. So many things happen really in late December in his life, including the one meaningful, deep romantic and erotic relationship he had, which was incredible. The form of grace there in the last 5, 6, 7 years of his life. And it took a long time to figure out. We only had that half year to be with him. And then we had 5 years to try to not screw it up. And we finished the film in maybe a little bit less than that in 2019. And, when we finally could figure out, with Kate's help, with Bill's help, with the help of a remarkable crew, all those people who spoke about Oliver, Paul Theroux, Robert Krulwich, Temple Grandin, who brought in the autism community in a really remarkable way. Doctors, patients, people who had family members. That this was a story really of two things: a man looking back late in his life on what his life meant to him and confronting his own death. And as Lawrence Weschler, credible writer who knew Oliver really well, had known him for 40 years, said that when he got the news from Kate that Oliver had died, he felt this tremendous welling up of gladness, because as Ren Weschler put it, Oliver had nailed the landing. He'd given a master class in how to die, which, you put it, it sounds like potentially so morbid. And it's not, it's so beautiful. There's so much grace in it that he had this strength to take the last and in some sense, most potent reality of being a living, sentient being when you come to the end of sentience and being, and to exemplify that for others. And so the story was a man in full confronting the end of his life. And when we understood that that was the form, and at a certain point, it's Oliver Sacks drops the mic, and just to try to follow that and be true to that. And that's, so we had the help of a remarkable cohort of people in making this film. Without whom, I'm sure, if it hadn't killed us, we could have easily screwed it up.
Well, beautifully done. It was an incredible showcase of Oliver's life and the tremendous effort and care that he put into understanding his patients, and of course where he gets his empathy from his just deep experience of just living life. He had a lot to cite, a frame of reference for virtually anybody he was talking to, it seemed like. Kate, you mentioned some of the footage that Ric was able to capture of him with his patients being out in the field without the white coat on. What does it mean to the Oliver Sacks Foundation to have this to look back on?
Well, speaking personally for myself, it's the greatest gift I could have possibly wanted. It's, it's such a beautiful portrait of this man. And even for those who didn't know him, we so often get the comment that, his voice had that incredible quality. People would often come up after lectures and say, I would come and listen to him read the phone book. And there was just something very soothing about that. And to have that saved and curated for the ages is just enormous. It's really a mitzvah. I think Ric did an absolutely tremendous job. It was not easy. And, to capture somebody as complicated as Oliver, as troubled as Oliver for much of his life, in a mere 2 hours is really, I think, an amazing achievement.
Ric, was there anything that surprised you from Oliver? Anything you learned about Oliver in this project that that maybe you didn't expect?
So Ravenna out the door. I think it was all projects worth doing. Certainly this was one. Kind of transform the people who make them. And this one began to transform my colleagues and myself very rapidly. Shortly after getting that phone call, we plowed into Oliver's apartment, as I mentioned. And the first interview was 5 days long. I'll tell you, that's unusual. We were with Oliver from 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, February 9th, and we left his apartment. Well, we went home at noon on Friday at 9:30. We were there basically 12 hours a day, pausing for times that Oliver would go swimming with Billy in the middle of the day, even though he had this metastasized cancer, ocular melanoma. And, he would read from his unpublished manuscript. He would talk. He would show us the periodic tables that he had, his minerals, his ferns, his plants. He would joke. He would laugh. He would be angry at his next door neighbor. He would talk about orange jello, which nobody whoever sees this film will ever think about orange jello in quite the same way again. Remarkable honesty that was shocking. And I think that what was transformative by the end of the week was to be taken so deeply, and not at all pornographically. This is not somebody kind of like wantonly revealing himself. And not a showboat, though he was hammy in his own lovely way. This is somebody who is really taking you really in a very moral way, deeply into what it is to be, in this case, him as a human being. Because he knew how important that was, not like in some grandiose way, but that this is what it is. And so what was transforming? It's this tremendous thing. It's very New York, in the sense that, you know, New York is this funny, aspirational, and democratic place. It takes 1 minute to become a New Yorker. That's why he settled here and never left. Never became a citizen of the United States, but he sure as hell became a citizen of New York. Stayed here his whole adult life. Where there's something which New York expresses in its own way, which is like, we all get to be here. No invidious comparisons get to be made. We also all get to strive and struggle and do the most with what we got. And Oliver knew that. And there was just something about, it's almost a kind of form of secular testifying to the beauty of being alive that could move you to tears within a few hours of knowing Oliver. That I think anybody who ever picked up an article he ever wrote, or a book he ever wrote, or listened to a lecture got right away. That he was testifying to the deepest stuff that it is to be around. And that's transforming. And you don't go into a film going like, I'm gonna meet kind of a guy he's almost like the Dalai Lama. He laughs in a kind of a funny, vulgar way. You know, he eats too much. He tells stupid jokes. He's not like, you know, there's a kind of a grammar of everyday life in the way he is, because he knows that that's part of what it is to be one of any of us as well, and he's not going to leave that stuff out. And that was transforming, and I don't think I knew when Kate called me that was what was going to happen with this project. But I'm sure as hell glad that the phone rang that night in early January of 2015, because it was as Kate as transforming a project as my colleagues and I have had the good fortune to be involved in. So mitzvah all around.
Yeah, it was, I love the level of detail. You know, I mean, he opened up deeply, but there's a lot of fun stuff about him too. I love seeing his, well, for one, I didn't know he had a weightlifting record. That was interesting. And then his obsession with the periodic table and his, what do you have? He had like a bedspread and periodic table socks. And one of my favorite quotes of the whole thing is, I think he said, if you doubt reality, drop tungsten on your foot. And just, it's such a quotable movie.
I mean, that's the thing. His interest was so wide. He started out interested in science and physics and chemistry, then biology and botany, then, you know, neurology and brain science. You know, he's interested in philosophy, interested in literature. His huge library, which Bill Hayes, his partner, discovered, and Kate already knew a lot of this, was infinitely annotated across the course of 60 or 70 years in his handwriting, a kind of a form of conversation, which he never thought would ever be revealed, but which our cameras got to see after he died, where he's talking to Descartes or to somebody who criticized a book of his, where it's this ongoing conversation, which is so beautiful, with people who are thinking and feeling about the world, whether they're, you know, other psychiatrists or psychologists or neurologists or Darwin, who was a huge hero of his. So these big questions like, why did the world come about? Or how did life evolve? Or where did we get these brains from? All of it was part of the wonder that Oliver brought into the world. So absolutely, if you doubt reality, drop a piece of rather heavy metal on your foot, you know, and maybe like do the job. And that kind of lovely sort of, he had a kind of like a vaudeville, Vauxhall kind of like campy, quality to him. You go, bleh, he had just this wonderful way. And a lot of what I love that our wonderful main cinematographer captured was whether this camera was seeing Oliver or the camera was seeing Bill Hayes or seeing Kate or whomever it was, he caught people on camera thinking and feeling. It wasn't just what they were saying or what you could feel people thinking. And when we get to Orange Jello and Oliver suddenly looks away, he's eating green Jello at the time. He looks away and kind of like, he thinks for a second, and the voice off says, it's Bill, says, Oliver, what are you thinking about? And Oliver says, I can't say. And you don't know what the hell is going on. But it's so lovely because suddenly everything about what it is to be a human being, all the stuff you can't see is dancing in front of you. And I just go, what a great gift. In this case, also just to have, in addition to Oliver, like a wonderful cameraman, Buddy Squires, who knows to stay on the subject because he, like Lowell Handler, when he's taking a photograph, is noticing the details at the right moment and staying on it. So, but as a famous one once said,
So I'm going to move on to a couple questions about his legacy, but Amanda, wondering if you have any thoughts. Was there anything that surprised you in watching the documentary? I don't know, anything that stood out to you?
So many things in the documentary stood out to me, but I think really my takeaway, and it was really reinforced because I was obviously familiar with Oliver Sacks's work and what he has meant to the TS community. But I think in watching the documentary, it was so well done. And I think, for me, just reinforced how much we could all very much learn from him, and his clear commitment to, others and the humanity that he exuded, really, which truly came through a pure and genuine curiosity to understand people, to understand not only what ailments or conditions were impacting them and to really sort of step into their shoes in the best way that he could, but, to really take that and then reflect it out to the public with the hopes that they would really be able to embrace what he learned through his curiosity. For me, that's something that I would love it if everybody who sees this documentary really takes with them into their day-to-day. I think if we were all genuinely curious and willing to say the difficult thing in the effort to really get a true, meaningful understanding of what seems foreign or bizarre in some way to us. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could have those true exchanges on a day-to-day basis as we came in contact with people in whatever realm? So I think just for me, that's the really that for me was the reinforced takeaway in my hope that I can be better in that way, and that others will think that they should be better in that way as well.
Well, that's perfect. And moving into his legacy and how we want to remember Oliver and Lowell, I want to ask you, what do you think Oliver himself would want those listening, everybody participating right now, what do you think Oliver would want all of us to take away or know about his years of research and understanding Tourette syndrome?
I think absolutely just what all of us have said today, that his whole understanding of these phenomena was that he did understand, was that he understood what it was like to be different. Kate, what's Steve's last name? The guy who wrote the review in the Lambda Literary Review.
Susoyev, yeah.
How do you say it?
Susoyev.
Sasoyev. This guy wrote a review in the Lambda Literary Review, and what he said in it, I think, was very important, and it wasn't said in any other review that was done, and that is Oliver had the extreme empathy for all these people because he felt something was wrong with himself. He felt that he too was an other and was different, and that, I think, was one of the key motivations. And I want, don't you agree, Kay?
I absolutely agree. And I think that, that's so clear in Ric's film. There's, in so many ways he felt other. He was a brilliant young child, exiled from his family because of World War II and the bombing.
And expected to become a doctor.
He was gay in a time when that was in a place where that was absolutely not okay. And he was odd. I mean, he was odd in many ways. So certainly that increased his empathy, I have no doubt. But I think another thing that we should take away from this, and you see this again in the film, is that yes, compassion, yes, intellectual curiosity and passion were so important to him, but equally a sense of wonder and joy and fun and humor. And even here in the last 9 months of his life, I'm thinking back to a little tiny list that he wrote almost the day he got the diagnosis of this mortal illness. And I'm going to paraphrase it, but it had things like, I want to work, I want to get more writing done, I want to spend time with my friends and family, I don't want to, waste any time with silly bullshit. And the last one was like, but don't forget to have fun and be silly. And I just love that. And even in these patients who he dealt with who had the most dire conditions, he would find a way to connect with them and a way to find humor and joy and wonder.
As Kate said, he was curious about everything. He wanted to know about everything, no matter how extraneous or how different anything was from something else. He wanted to find out about it. And I think that curiosity also is what drove him incredibly.
Yes, and every body. I mean, he loved, at the end of his life, he wasn't driving because he had visual problems, and he would often take ride service, Uber or whatnot. And he loved that because each trip was a chance to get to know some new driver. And he would come back and tell me all these stories about this driver from Nepal and his whole life and his family. And it was really lovely.
There's just one tiny thing that David Remnick, the editor of New Yorker, said at Oliver's New York memorial service, which was recorded. We didn't include it in the film, but I often wish we had, because it's so relevant to what we're talking about right now. That Remnick said towards the end of his really beautiful remarks about Oliver, who he knew well. He published 35, 40 pieces of his, or rather 35 or 40 had been published in the New Yorker over the decades. That there comes a time, Remnick said, when you're reading any piece by Oliver, where you go, you the reader, this man writing is just as strange and just as original and just as rich and just as wonderful as this person he's writing about. And then you pause, you the reader, with the second realization, you go, and you know what? So am I. So am I. And that two-step, the realization that the author has this direct connection of some kind to the subject matter, but then that you, the reader, have the same connection to the author and the subject matter. And my gut feeling is, this is Remnick's, I think, brilliant insight, Oliver began and ended with this sense, not only of his own difference, but all of our difference, and his joy and wonder in it, that, you know, that we are all, which rings true for so many of us who hide behind either a pretense or a small fig leaf of normalcy, some during some or all of our lives. And you know, convention is a great thing. But who among us do not, secretly or not so secretly, understand that we're different?
You know, I'm seeing so many great comments in the chat box, and I wish we had hours and hours. But one in particular was a question of, is this film going out to the medical community? And the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, just this month, in addition to this conference, we were able to show the film to a conference of the American Academy of Neurology. And we are certainly getting into the educational environment. So our hope is that this film is seen broadly by people of all ages, and particularly, of course, people in the medical profession.
Well, it might be time to keep it going for some questions from the chat. I'll just, last thing I'll say, and I'll kick it over to Amanda if she has anything she'd like to say about Oliver Sacks' style and what it means to the community and what we hope to see in the future. But I just, you know, there was a quote that said, Oliver wanted to be in the skin of someone with Tourette syndrome. And this speaks to everything we've been talking about. Again, that sense of empathy. We mentioned Shane Festel. I love that it showed him. He was really warm and supportive to me when I was a little kid. You know, I saw him at a few different Tourette conferences. He always took time to, you know, ask me what was up, and it was cool. And that he reached out and put a positive face on Tourette for me when I was a little kid, trying to, you know, I was struggling with that. And that's confirmed in the film, where Shane credits Dr. Sacks for making him feel positive about his Tourette, that it wasn't just a deficiency, it was an excess and something you can revel in. And I just love that turn of making you feel good about something that other people think might needs to be fixed or something. And it just adds all the humanity. Amanda, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that. And then I think we can probably take, we got some time for audience questions. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I mean, I think the only thing that I'll add is that, you know, just to reiterate about how grateful I am that we're doing this today. You know, we are celebrating the 50th year of the Tourette Association next year. And I think, you know, the success of the organization, you know, certainly sits to a large degree on the shoulders of Oliver Sacks, and for what he did to really raise awareness of the condition, and do the storytelling that I think is so integral in being able to, you know, communicate that people are so much more than their Tourette, which is something that we talk about a lot. And again, just, you know, that I hope we can all sort of lead and take from his example, you know, the curiosity, and really in a world where we're always rushing to one place or another, or rushing to, you know, make a judgment, or, you know, that we maybe think about Oliver Sacks and the time that he really took and invested to slow down and truly try to understand and see through someone else's lens the world as they were looking at it. And I certainly agree that we're all a little bizarre. And, you know, and I think we should all be proud of that, and we should all own that, because normal's boring.
I agree, Amanda. So I think, it's 1:50 p.m. Eastern. Megan, do you want to give me some questions?
I will jump in. So we have about 10 minutes left. First, I just want to mirror what Kate said. So the chat that's coming in today is exceptional. It really touches on the impact that Oliver had on so many people, and it really has come through in the way that people have learned from him, learned about their own condition back in the 70s and 80s when there wasn't as much working knowledge. So for those who had joined after Kate had given an introduction, Kate, can you just touch on how was it that Oliver became interested in the field of Tourette syndrome?
Oliver first became, I think, really aware of Tourette syndrome in probably the early 70s, partly because some patients of his with a different condition were having Tourette-like symptoms, but he soon started investigating not only the original reports of Tourette from the 19th century, but began taking on a few patients, and he started writing about some of those people in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And then he soon after that met Lowell Handler, who was his introducer in some ways to the world of Tourette, to many different people with Tourette around this country and across the world. I'm seeing Steve Bachner is in the house, and shout out to Steve.
Yeah, shout out to Steve. I want to say that too.
Oliver went to several conferences, including the one in McLean, Virginia. I think that was the one, maybe Ben, where you met him. And the one in Cincinnati, and they all have their own mythology and folklore associated with them. But they were incredible occasions for people who had been so isolated by this so-called rare disease, which we now know is not that rare at all, to be able to gather together and share. And I just also want to squeeze in here, someone asked about how do I tell my friends about this film? If you go to oliversacks.com, you will find some links to take you to a page for the film, which is called oliversacksdoc.com. And that'll give you all kinds of ways to connect and figure out where it's showing and how you can tell your friends about it. Thank you for that. And also, I just have to say that Lowell was too modest to mention his wonderful book. And you should look that up if you don't know it already, Twist and Shout.
Twitch and Shout.
Twitch and Shout. God, I'm a Beatles fan. What can I say?
But thank you. Yes, that was a memoir that I wrote that came out in 1998. So it's a long time ago, but it's been in print all of this time.
So that's great. So I think, Lowell, this would be a good one for you to answer. So the film referenced that other neurologists may not have taken him seriously during that time, possibly because he was so forward thinking. Why do you think that was? And maybe when was the turning point for people to understand the impact of his work?
Well, of course, the impact of his work, as Kate can tell you, greatly preceded the time when he was accepted by the medical establishment. Kate says in Ric's film that she felt he really wasn't accepted widely by the medical profession until after the film Awakenings came out, which was in 1990. So certainly he had a huge number of readers previous to that. But I think that also the medical community was slow to accept his work because it was very unusual. It raised a lot of eyebrows, like the time that he took the female patient on a motorcycle ride from the hospital. It was really, people were really taken aback by how he got personally involved with the patient. And of course, that was the whole point of what made it so incredible.
Right. And Amanda, you touched on this a little just briefly ago, but so a question is, a great deal has changed in our understanding of TS since Oliver first began writing about it in the 1980s, both in terms of science and perhaps more importantly, in social attitudes. Do you think that Sacks's work is still relevant and will continue to be relevant for years to come?
100%. That's the short answer. 100%. I think if we find that his work is not relevant and still a point of discussion and his style something to emulate as it relates to really, again, wanting to understand and get to the heart of people and the conditions that impact them, we will be greatly disserved.
Yeah. And so this might be next for Kate or for Lowell, but there was a note. So did Oliver focus on people with extreme forms of TS? I don't know if you guys want to talk about that in any capacity.
Well, not exclusively, but he did have a name, an actual category, which of course he invented for people with extreme Tourette, called phantasmagoric, or what was it? Phantasmagorical symptoms, right? Like that's how he would refer to Shane that way, or he would refer to somebody that way who had very noticeable, very pronounced symptomatology. So, of course, that was a word that he, a category that he kind of invented. And of course, the word Touretteer was something he invented, which is, a slang word now for somebody who has Tourette syndrome. But none of this was derogatory. It was, he could have written his own DSM.
That would be very interesting to see. I mean, I think Oliver would have said that. Yes, sometimes he was accused of like, well, why are you only writing about the people with these very severe situations? And the answer is, of course, those examples amplify our ability to understand this condition as a whole. So, for, in a way, dramatic purposes, yes, he was very interested in those people sort of at the far end of the bell curve, but as you say, Lowell, not exclusively.
Right. Well, it's the same thing with filmmaking. Rick can tell you, and with photography, you have to have some extreme example to portray it in a way that is readable in whatever medium you're working in. And it's the same thing when you're writing about it.
Yep.
So we have time for just one more question before you wrap up, and I think this one would be appropriate for Ben. So some people believe that Touretters have special abilities that non-Touretters lack. Do you agree, and what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's some science to it as well when it comes to what we can do with memory. And I mean, if you want to talk more colloquially and maybe less scientific and maybe more on personal value, I feel like I have excess energy. I feel like I don't need quite as much sleep, which I don't think is quite true. But the one that keeps coming up on the podcast is the one we've been talking about the entire time, which is the sense of empathy that you get from knowing that you could be in a situation where you might be misunderstood or mistreated, and you don't want to, you're conscious that that could happen to somebody else. So you give people room to breathe, you give people room to be themselves, and maybe give people an opportunity to be less of a negative curiosity, to where if people are worried about, what I'm doing in public or what somebody with TS is doing in public, if you're concerned about them, you can maybe ask if they're okay, but don't do it just so you can satisfy your own curiosity of what's this person doing, what's this weirdo doing. I think someone with TS has the ability to, from that experience, and experience is such a key theme and throughout the whole documentary, you have the experience to know how to relate to other people. And I think that makes you more of an open person, more of an ability to connect with other people. I know that when I started talking openly about having TS, which I didn't talk about for most of my adult life because I was embarrassed by it. Once I started talking about that, other people started opening up to me and telling me, because I think it's a sign of trust that you can talk about something that might be perceived as a flaw or an insecurity in yourself and talk kind of confidently about it. And other people feel a little bit more comfortable sharing about themselves. And I think that just makes you, or gives you the ability to connect with people in a different kind of way. So that, I think, is kind of a superpower.
Thank you. I agree. So thank you so much to everyone that was able to join us today. If we didn't get to your questions, we'll make sure that we can get some of those answers for you. But to each of our panelists, thank you so much. Rick, there's something that I took away from this. You said it bridges our infinite range of uniqueness. I thought that was such a beautiful sentiment, and something that I'll take away from this presentation, of course, from Oliver's wonderful work. But thank you again for joining us. This presentation will be on our YouTube channel. We'll put it on Tourette.org. Of course, it's the start of Tourette Awareness Month, so there are plenty of ways to stay connected with the TAA, to give back, to contribute, and to get involved throughout the month. So you can visit us at Tourette.org/awareness to learn more about that. And I just want to thank you all again for joining us today. Have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much for having us, Megan.
Thanks, everybody.
It's been wonderful to be with you.
Likewise. Bye-bye.